Welcome everyone to The Explainer. Today we're doing something a little different. We are conducting a true clinical autopsy of a match that left American soccer fans completely stunned. I'm talking, of course, about the U.S. men's national team's absolutely crushing 4-1 defeat to Belgium in the World Cup round of 16. It was a night where, honestly, unprecedented hype slammed headfirst into a very sobering reality. Because look, this wasn't just a simple loss. This was a moment that carries immense historical weight. It's a match that forces us to take a really unvarnished, honest look at exactly what goes wrong when a team simply shatters under the brightest lights imaginable. Today, we're going to completely unpack this. We're looking at the tactics, the individual breakdowns, and most importantly, the complete psychological collapse of a squad that just could not cope with the immense, suffocating pressure of the knockout stage. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today's breakdown. We'll start with how the hype met reality, examine how the team shattered under that knockout pressure, and break down Belgium's tactical masterclass. Then we'll track the snowballing individual errors, judge Mauricio Pochettino's tenure so far, and finally end with a much-needed reality check. Section 1. The hype meets reality. To truly understand this collapse, we first have to understand the context. We have to talk about the intoxicating arrogance of the public expectations leading right up to the opening whistle, and how sharply that contrasted with the sobering final result. There was just a massive, undeniable disconnect between expectation and reality. According to the pundits we're sourcing today, that phenomenal early performance the U.S. had against Paraguay, specifically, that fantastic 45 to 60-minute stretch of total suffocating dominance, well, it created a completely unsustainable hype machine. The public and media began setting this impossibly high bar. People were openly talking down the Belgian team. They were calling their golden generation too old, saying their legs were gone, and literally dismissing their threat outright. And this sheer arrogance from the outside essentially set the American team up for a much harsher psychological fall. Because the reality painted a vastly different picture. It was a humbling, class-defining 4-1 defeat. Belgium was professional, they were fiercely focused, and they dictated the tempo from their very first second. The U.S. wasn't just beaten, they were given an absolute top-to-bottom lesson in knockout soccer. 7. Take a second to think about that number. That is the number of consecutive games the U.S. has failed to beat Belgium. In fact, if you want to find the last time the U.S. men's national team actually secured a win against them, you have to go all the way back to the year 1930. 1930! The analysts point out that going into a match with an arrogant, presumptuous mindset against a team you haven't defeated in nearly a century is quite literally a perfect recipe for disaster. Belgium heard the noise, folks. They read the press clippings, they played with a massive chip on their shoulder, and they proved exactly why they are a European powerhouse, entirely unbothered by the American hype machine. Section 2. Shattered under knockout pressure. And this brings us to the absolute core diagnosis of this entire explainer. Former U.S. international Herculez Gomez hit the nail on the head. He put it this way: psychologically and mentally, they weren't ready for the moment. Psychologically, they were already beaten. I want you to think about what that really means at this elite, razor-thin level of the sport. The sources make it undeniably clear that the U.S. didn't just lose a physical or tactical battle out there. They withdrew into a shell from the opening minute. The team had coasted through earlier group stage matches when things were going their way, when the wind was at their backs and everything felt easy. But the moment, the exact second, they stepped under the intense, unforgiving lights of the round of 16, they shrank. When they faced real, physical adversity against a top-tier European opponent, they looked completely green. They lacked the grit. They literally beat themselves mentally before the game even had a chance to get going, entirely succumbing to the immense weight of the moment. So how did this psychological paralysis actually look on the pitch? Well, let's look at the stats. By the very first hydration break, Belgium had tallied 7 shots on goal. The U.S.? 0. Nothing. Absolutely zilch. This striking statistic tells a devastating story about a team's mental state in a knockout game. The pressure forced the American players into a deeply passive, frightened defensive posture. They were pinned deep in their own half, utterly toothless in the attack, and playing with this visible, frantic, nervous energy. You could see it in their body language. Even basic, routine 5-yard passes were constantly being misplaced without any direct pressure from the Belgian defense. It was like their legs turned to jelly. The moment was simply too big, and the paralysis was total. Section 3. Belgium's tactical masterclass. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how Belgium forced the U.S. into that shell. Over on the sideline, Belgium's manager, Rudy Garcia, orchestrated an absolute tactical masterclass. He completely cut off the legs of Mauricio Pochettino's game plan. We all know the U.S. relies heavily on a mobile, dynamic midfield, specifically using Weston McKennie and Malik Tillman to drive the ball forward.
Well, Belgium countered by having Nicolas Raskin and Amadou Onana relentlessly suffocate those passing lanes. They left McKennie entirely isolated. He was practically nowhere to be found. Furthermore, the U.S. relies heavily on overlapping fullbacks Anthony Robinson and Sergiño Dest to create offensive width. Right? Well, Belgium countered this by deploying Dodi Lukebakio and Timothy Castagne to aggressively attack down those exact flanks. This pinned the U.S. fullbacks so incredibly deep in their own defensive third that they couldn't possibly drive forward to help the attack. And when the U.S. tried their usual high press to force turnovers, Belgium composed themselves, they didn't panic for a single second, and simply played out of the back with easy 1-2 touch combinations that left the Americans just chasing shadows.
11. That is the staggering number of giveaways star player Christian Pulisic had in just the first 45 minutes of the match. Now, when your star player, your captain, shatters under the tactical pressure and the weight of the moment like that, the rest of the team inevitably follows suit. The U.S. midfield was so thoroughly suffocated that their best, most creative player literally couldn't find a single pocket of space without turning the ball over. The passing accuracy for the entire team was uncharacteristically abysmal, which just goes to show how effectively Belgium's structure disrupted the American rhythm and, worse, amplified that psychological collapse we talked about.
Section 4. Snowballing individual errors. Look, when your tactics are entirely neutralized and your psychology is that fragile, things are going to start falling apart and fast. The physical symptoms of Belgium's dominance resulted in a tragic, frankly catastrophic sequence of individual mistakes from key vitriol players. First, Sergiño Dest was constantly dispossessed on the flank, looking completely out of sorts. It got so bad it ultimately led to him being subbed off at halftime. Then, you have 39-year-old veteran center back Tim Ream. He got completely posterized and bodied by a false 9 on a cross, a really shocking lapse in physicality from such a seasoned pro. But even worse, goalkeeper Matt Fries, who was playing in his first real high-stakes test, hesitated while trying to play the ball out of the back with his left foot. The pressure just got to him. He second-guessed himself, got his pocket picked inside his own box, and surrendered a back-breaking third goal. Add in late, completely unforced errors from Chris Richards, and you have a total, undeniable defensive meltdown. These weren't just physical missteps, guys. These were the direct results of overwhelming knockout stage pressure, forcing experienced veterans into amateur, panic-induced decisions.
The pundits summarized it perfectly, saying it was one error after another that snowballed and sent the U.S. into a psyche they could never overcome. It was quite literally a snowball rolling downhill, gathering this devastating momentum. You simply cannot afford to have failing grades across almost the entire starting 11 in a World Cup knockout match. In a game of this magnitude, self-inflicted wounds are fatal. Now, it's worth noting the U.S. did manage to get a brief lifeline with an equalizer from a brilliant Malik Tillman free kick. But they almost immediately conceded again due to incredibly poor marking in the box. And honestly, conceding immediately after an equalizer is the absolute ultimate proof of a shattered psyche. They had a way back into the game. They had a moment to reset, and they immediately threw it away because they just couldn't handle the escalating tension. So this brings us to a massive question. Did Mauricio Pochettino fail the test, or did the players? I mean, when an entire team looks that fatigued, that disconnected, and that error-prone on the biggest stage imaginable, where does the ultimate blame actually lie?
Section 5. Judging Pochettino's tenure.
The evaluation of his 20-month tenure as the highest-paid coach in U.S. men's national team history is completely split right now. On one hand, the defense of Pochettino points out that he has undeniably inspired a new, vibrant cultural energy within the program. Before this collapse, the team really did bring a genuine joy back to the fan base and showcased a unified, resilient American culture to the globe during the group stages. But on the other hand, the criticism is equally harsh and entirely data-driven. The defining trait of Pochettino's tenure has been constant, maddening inconsistency. Furthermore, U.S. Soccer completely reset the financial market to hire him, right? They paid top dollar for elite European pedigree. Yet the result, a round of 16 exit, is the exact same result achieved by previous, far less expensive managers like Bruce Arena and Jurgen Klinsmann. The tactical inflexibility we saw against Belgium proves there are still massive fundamental hurdles for this manager to overcome. Pochettino himself faced the media after the game, and he admitted, "It wasn't our day, we didn't show what we normally can show, and that's the reality." He noted that the team simply couldn't connect with the flow of the game and failed to execute basic day-one fundamentals. Now, while it is a remarkably honest assessment of a flat, completely toothless performance, it leaves fans with a really lingering anxiety. Because if he couldn't get the team's energy levels and psychological readiness up for the biggest match of their lives, you have to ask, is he truly the right manager for the long-term 4-year cycle leading up to 2026? Section 6, a reality check. So if this team is going to actually mature from this psychological collapse, the sources highlight 3 clinical steps they have to take. Step 1,
The team has to acknowledge the false security they get from dominating smaller CONCACAF nations. Look, beating teams like Haiti or Guadeloupe gives the illusion of an elite status that simply isn't real on the world stage. Step 2, to fix this, they need to start scheduling high-stakes, hostile environment matches against South American giants. We're talking teams like Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia. They need to experience being deeply uncomfortable on a regular basis. And step 3, which is probably the most vital of all, through that high-level exposure, they must build genuine mental resilience for adversity. They have to develop a callus. They need to cultivate the grit required so that they stop completely crumbling and retreating into a shell the minute a top-tier team like Belgium punches them in the mouth.
But hey, it is not all doom and gloom. Despite the painful knockout collapse, the sources all agree that this World Cup run achieved undeniable off-pitch victories. This team inspired a whole new generation of youth across the country to play the game. They showcased a beautiful, unified, and positive American culture to the globe, completely free of the usual politics. And they successfully brought joy, excitement, and relevance back to a national fan base that had been starving for it for years. Culturally speaking, this tournament remains a massive milestone for the sport in the United States.
But it leaves us with this final thought. Does the USMNT need to step out of CONCACAF to truly evolve before 2026? Is a drastic change in environment and daily competition the only way to cure the psychological shattering we just witnessed against Belgium? It is a massive existential question for U.S. soccer moving forward. Thank you so much for joining me to dissect this fascinating match. Keep learning, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next explainer.